So, you want to see more progress with my twin-turbo V10 Nissan Patrol? Well, not today.
Hello there. This video is not going to be in my typical style, because I'm here to address the most commonly occurring comment since this car got running. And that comment is, why don't you run an aftermarket ECU? Wouldn't it be easier to use an aftermarket ECU? Why don't you use a haltech? And as we all know, bullying people on the internet is like my fourth favourite thing to do in the world. So today, I'm going to do that. Now for those of you that are new, I'm building a V10 twin-turbo Nissan Patrol, which is a diesel. A PD diesel. This is probably the most important point. And this video is basically explaining the thought process and everything involved in turning this car from a pile of scrap metal into something that runs and drives. Why I have to justify my own project? Who knows, but I'm gonna do it. So, Internet Warrior sat behind your screen, who thinks he knows stuff. Listen very carefully and call me out on anything you think is wrong. Because it won't be me that's wrong. So let's start with the absolute basics. What is an ECU? In my case, it's supposed to go here. Mine's still between Australia and America right now, so I don't have one to show you. But basically, there's one, so geniusly superimposed that you can't tell the difference. And this basically means engine control unit. Now people seem to think that an ECU is some magical device that does everything and it's caused by wizards. And the truth is, it's a very simple device. It's a computer. It takes a signal from a sensor, does computing things, and spits out a reaction. There are many things in this car that do the same thing, or any car for that matter that uses any kind of electronics. But seeing as it just so happens to be connected to an engine, that's why it's called an ECU. Could be a windscreen wiper controller for all I know. Same principles. Now computers are generally stupid. They read like humans do, from the top to the bottom. So let's use a very basic example. There is a coolant sensor about there. And as you know, most of the time, when a car is warming up from cold, the idle will be a little bit higher. So ignoring all the other sensors involved and focusing just on that one, in programming terms, you'd probably use something called a while loop. And what this does is it reads a bunch of signals, and as the name implies, while it is within this range, this happens. Otherwise, this happens. And as you can see, in this case, when the temperature is below, the idle RPM will be here. Otherwise, it's going to be here. Now repeat this process for every single sensor on the entire engine, and that's an ECU. So, example time. I have an input device, which is this remote control. I have a computer in this window, and then I have an output device, which is the electronic rams that open it. I activate the input device. The computer does its thing, and then outputs to the motors. Same as an ECU, just stack it hundreds of times and do it very quickly. Yes. Now you might have heard the word CAN bus thrown around a lot, because this engine runs on it. That's essentially the same thing, but rather than having one ECU that controls the engine and everything else is a separate unit, everything is combined into one network. This means that your engine can talk to your gearbox, and any other associated unit can do it. It's more complicated, but you can do a lot more with it. Now when an ECU is working properly, here's a good metaphor for it.
Hello? So what's up, B?
And this probably applies better to CAN bus rather than regular ECUs, but we're talking about CAN bus today, so it's better. So now we move on to the tricky topic of standalone ECUs. Now if you buy a standalone ECU, open the box and try to plug it into your car, the result will be something like this.
We got to celebrate our differences.
You can research that song in your own time. And this is because none of the sensors are calibrated to that ECU that you're using. So you have to do everything manually. Why is that tricky? Let's take this sensor as an example. This is a manifold absolute pressure sensor, boost sensor if you like. I'm guessing it's going to be resistance based. And what this would mean is that as the pressure increases in here, something will either move or vary in temperature, which causes a resistance change, which is then sent to the ECU. Now you might be thinking to yourself, calibration might be simple. You just measure it at atmospheric, and then you add 10 psi, and then measure it again, then you've got your graph. But that's where you're assuming two things that shouldn't be assumed. Firstly, you're assuming that it's a linear plot, which isn't always the case, especially with thermal things. And the other thing you'd be assuming is that that's a perfectly functioning and operational sensor, which brings me on to why the stock ECU would have an advantage. The stock ECU is programmed with a threshold for every sensor. This means that if one sensor falls below or above a certain threshold, it'll tell the ECU that this sensor is not functioning properly. Now, unless you buy a brand new sensor for every system, or get the documents from the manufacturer for each sensor, provided they give you a plot, rather than just a range of acceptable resistance values, then you'll be setting up your aftermarket ECU with a flawed set of sensors and no way of really knowing about it, adding to your joys of fault finding. Anyway, got slightly sidetracked. Standalone ECU. There is absolutely a time and a place to use them. One of the prime examples, I would say, is converting a car from a carburetted engine into a fuel-injected engine. This is a case of making a very simple ECU setup, which involves one or two sensors, and you get all the benefits of using an electronic injection system. The other example I can think of, I'm sure there's many more, but some car manufacturers like to heavily lock down their ECUs so that nobody can even change the maps on them. And this can be combined with a small community, so there isn't really that support base there to help you hack them, so to speak. Now, I've designed several control systems, not specifically for engines, but for controlling various aspects related to an engine. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about tuning, but I'd say I'm pretty clued up on almost everything else. Find me below. Now, let's say I wanted to use a standalone ECU on this engine. First off, this is a PD diesel engine, and without going into heaps of detail about a PD versus a common rail versus mechanical fuel pump, PD diesel in this case, on a V10, essentially has 10 fuel pumps. Each fuel pump with a pressure regulator, pressure sensor, injector controller. Combined with that, everything's doubled, so I have a MAP sensor, a MAF sensor, on each side of the engine. And then you have every other sensor associated with this, such as your lambda sensors in the exhaust, temperature sensors at various points along the circuit. And this is all combined with a very niche market. Nobody does the V10 swaps because they are supposedly extremely complicated. So let's say I find some obscure company that's able to have an aftermarket ECU with all of these input capabilities to work with my engine and all of its associated sensors. I'm essentially left with a semi-homemade piece of hardware that's maybe been sold less than 100 times, that's cost me as much as the software I use to program my real ECUs, with no real scope for replacement other than paying for another one if I make a mistake. Moving on to the flip side of this, my factory ECU. Massive online community. Many people have done crazy things with these ECUs, and they're all essentially the same across Volkswagen's production line of this era. Now, Volkswagen got around this by using two ECUs, controlling one bank on each ECU. These are then connected in a master and slave situation, which, going back to the aftermarket ECUs, if it can't cope with 10 signals all at once, I'd then have to get two, double the price, figure out a way to link them in a master and slave scenario, and even then, it won't work as well as the factory ones. Coupled with this, I then have to calibrate every single sensor associated with this, assuming I can get the data or test them accurately enough to make a proper plot to go into the ECU programming. Kind of annoys me when people say programming related to ECUs. So let's say I've done all that. I've got this engine running. All the sensors are calibrated to this one or two set of aftermarket ECUs that I've got. Cool, the engine runs. That's about it. Now, this situation might work in a manual conversion, because a manual gearbox can basically be considered a dumb system, meaning there's no real controllers other than a few lights to show what gear you're in or if the transfer case is active or not. And this is what happens when I would try and incorporate a standalone ECU with an existing gearbox controller. Warami, Bujurina Wunya.
What did he say?
And this brings me on nicely to another point I made at the beginning of the video, which is there are many different controllers throughout a car, especially on an automatic. This is an auto swap. As you can see, it's got the gay stick, but it also has this. And this. These controllers are just for the gearbox and transfer case. And this is where my hatred for the aftermarket community somewhat grows. Now, being an automatic conversion, you basically need a controller like this. This is part of the reason why many people who do engine swaps, they'll manualize a gearbox as if it's a good thing. But no, that is simply a compromise that still lets you change gear with an automatic gearbox. And the reason for this is that making an automatic controller to work with a foreign engine is pretty nightmarish. And in this case, using Volkswagen as an obvious example, Volkswagen is a huge global company. If you take the biggest aftermarket ECU company and get their entire net worth, Volkswagen has probably spent that on R&D on just that one module. So to think that I can do a better job using my primitive programming knowledge or whatever I can find on Facebook and forums to help me, there's basically no chance of me doing a better job. There's so much involved in controlling a gearbox like this that it's absolutely hopeless trying. And if you say otherwise, you're a complete idiot. Also, spoiler, how bloody good does my center console look? Now, one point I touched on earlier was ease of getting parts. I've mentioned a couple of times that my ECUs are now between Australia and America, and if they get lost, doesn't really matter. I can pick up another ECU for $100 or so, doesn't matter what car it's from, as long as these numbers line up, I can simply reflash it, and then it's the old ECU again. You might notice, this gearbox controller says Touareg V6. The part numbers are the same as the one on the V10. If I reflash this module, it'll work, regardless of what setup I've got in the engine bay. And if I use an aftermarket ECU, let's say I have to replace it, let's say it gets wet. The units cost thousands of dollars, and without any backing, I can say that the quality would not be as good as a reputable brand, such as Siemens in this case. And now I need to touch on the wiring aspect. Wiring is not like metalwork. Metalwork, the general rule is, it's easier to take something away than it is to put it back. But it could be argued it's the opposite with wiring. For me, it was much easier to simply remove the wires that I didn't need, and then I can make the rest of the loom suit where I need it to go. If I remove something I didn't need to, case in point, this brake light switch, it wasn't beyond capabilities to simply wire it back up again. And all of the stuff I have left is guaranteed to have been wired in the correct place, because the car was running before I took it apart, and it's running afterwards. Now let's say I'd opted for an aftermarket ECU, and I had swapped these two wires into the wrong place, simply because accidents happen. And I've already wired every single sensor up into my aftermarket ECU. The car wouldn't run, and by comparison there would be an absolute hell level of fault finding to do. So just for clarity's sake, I am in no way shitting on aftermarket ECUs. I think they absolutely have a place in the market, and finding a good quality one is a great thing for some projects, such as carburetor conversions or heavily locked down factory ECUs. But in this case, it's completely bloody unfeasible. So feel free to fight me below with your Facebook and forum knowledge. Because let's be honest, unless you've done it or work in the industry, you haven't got a bloody clue. So in my case, I have opted to maintain all the systems that I need to get this car running, remove all the ones that I don't need, and then use the massive support network that's readily available to make the ECU do what I want it to do. Seeing as these Volkswagen ECUs are some of the most customizable around, you just have to know how to do it. And pay for a little bit of hardware. Once. There's no spoilers here, if you like bike channels.